Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Unit 4 Zoom lecture. We'll just begin the evening with a few housekeeping announcements and make sure we're all on the same page moving forward. Then I will cover just a little bit of the lecture slides that we have an opportunity to cover, and then we will go into our student presentation and then office hours as per usual. Was there a question before we get started? Okay, so just wanted to kind of remind everybody that the Unit 2 quiz is already up, and the due date for that Unit 2 quiz, or the quiz 2 that covers Units 4 and 5, is October 8th. You have a lovely, restful week following that. You have, I've built in a bye week just to give everybody a break, kind of, not quite to the middle of the semester, but almost. And so there's nothing new. That really is just a break for you all, so you can kind of catch up, work ahead, do what you need to do that week. And then we will meet back on October 16th to cover the infancy unit. Will be our next Zoom meeting, so we won't have any Zooms for the next 2 Mondays after today. And then again, we'll have another 2-week break, then a Zoom, and then another 2-week break. And I did want to check in with you all to see if we could potentially move that last Zoom date from November 27th to November 20th, just so that we could actually, instead of having a course wrap up, if we could go ahead and have cover the older adulthood unit. So we don't have to make that decision right now, but just wanted to put that out there. So if you have any issues with that, please go ahead and email me and let me know. If you are scheduled, again, to do a presentation not on a covered or on a week that we have a covered Zoom, so I guess next week for Unit 5, the Pregnancy and Birth Unit, just a reminder that you are to upload a recorded lecture. So you have to find some way to record your lecture via Zoom. That should work just fine. I want to see all your faces while you're presenting, so definitely would like to avoid just doing the voiceovers using PowerPoint. So if you could use a Prezi or PowerPoint or whatever works for you, record that within that 20-minute time limit, and then upload that to the discussion board with your challenge question to the group. And that's how we're going to handle those weeks where we don't have a live presentation on the recorded Zoom. If you're one of those groups and you have any questions about that, please let me know, and we'll go from there. And let's see if there's any more announcements. I don't think so. So are there any other just general questions from anybody before we get started? Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We'll get the lecture pulled up. Feel free to stop me at any point. You know, I love spending a lot of time on this material. This is some of my favorite material, and that it's just something I'm personally, professionally very passionate about, so I could kind of talk about it for a very long time. So I'm kind of always sad that we don't have that much time to really have some good discussion, but so I'm going to keep the lecture as brief as possible, and really just hope to encourage any discussion and questions as we move forward. So if you have a burning question, don't hesitate to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask. Professor Terry Combs-Orme covered the HPA response cycle very, very well in her recorded lecture. So I didn't feel the need to kind of regurgitate any of that, but it is critically important, so I don't want to not talk about it at all tonight. If you feel you need a review, I'm happy to touch on things for a few minutes now or during office hours, or if you want to schedule some one-on-one time to just, if you're really kind of stuck on something, please feel free to reach out, because this really, really is a critical part of the kind of a piece of the puzzle when you start talking about human development and human behavior. So I want to make sure that every one of you has a really good understanding of how the HPA and stress response works in humans. The documentary Stress: Portrait of a Killer is one of my absolute favorites that we view this semester. It has I really like it because I feel like it brings to life all of the readings that you all have been doing. You get to see Dr. Sapolsky and his just, his full awesomeness within Kenya studying baboons. And so I love it. I feel like it really kind of covers, a lot of the major components, and I've included a number of other, readings and videos that touch on that. So I feel like it's pretty well covered in that it's kind of self-explanatory to a certain degree. But again, if you feel like you need some additional support understanding that, please let me know. So tonight I wanted to focus on the trauma cycle, which to some degree is somewhat simplified for our discussion here. There's a lot of individual variation in how a person responds to trauma. There's a number of factors that come into play, but because I wanted to cover it, because it, pretty much within this stress unit, because it's very relevant to understanding how, basically the outcomes of chronic stress. Because a lot of times, you could experience something stressful, but it may not be traumatic. Typically, things that are traumatic are also stressful because your HPA system is fully functioning during those traumatic moments. But how the support that people get in response to a trauma has a massive impact on whether or not that trauma is either resolved or unresolved. And so we're going to focus on the piece of the trauma being unresolved today. It can look like like you can resolve something. So I want to make sure that that's clear, but just for our time today, I'm going to focus on when a trauma gets unresolved and what can happen as a result. So when we're talking about trauma, remember there are, I guess I'll run back and cut this real quick. Just so we are all on the same page, I want to go ahead and define trauma for our purposes this evening. And I really like this definition. You may see some others. I know that the DSM-5 is going to have one, but I really like this one because it helps to understand and kind of pull apart some of the nuances of trauma, especially with trauma being something that is so, it's a word that is so embedded in our language and our culture at this point that it's very watered down to a certain degree and very overused. So I want to make sure that when you are using this word, especially when you're using this word in a clinical setting, in a professional setting, that you really have a solid understanding of what that is. And so I really like the 3 E's definition, which is about, which essentially says that the experience of an event by a person that is emotionally painful or distressful and which often results in lasting mental and physical effects. And some of the key pieces here are obviously there's an experience of an event and what are those lasting effects. Sometimes there are no lasting effects. Being exposed to an adverse event does not mean that a person will become traumatized or have those long-lasting effects. And many people experience adverse events without being traumatized. So that's really what we're talking about. There's a number of traumatic events. This list is not exhaustive by any stretch. You will see a number of these are included in the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, but some are not. Things like accident and illness, natural disaster, war, those are not covered on the ACEs study. Traumatic loss, the death of a parent, things like that, that's not on this list. Poverty is not on this list, and poverty can, bring about a number of circumstances that one might consider traumatic. just kind of ancillary things. So, but poverty is also not covered on the ACEs study. Traumatic experiences are typically, understood to be life-threatening, and that can include witnessing, let's say, witnessing someone being abused or witnessing a violent event. You may not actually be yourself a victim of that attack or that situation or that abuse. But if you witness it and you don't know if you're next, you really could feel like your life is in danger. Your psychological and physiological systems may become overwhelmed. So this whole idea of this subjectivity is very, very important. We can also think our way into a HPA response. We can essentially, worry ourselves into a heightened state. Traumatic experiences are going to vary between people, and they can also vary over time with the same person and per developmental level. And I want you to remember this as we move forward, because the age at which a person experiences a traumatic event will have a major, major impact on how they move, how they process, and how they move through that event. What is their cognitive level? What is their emotional development level? All of those things make a really big difference. And then you get into things like complex trauma, where you have kind of layer upon layer upon layer of trauma that are happening at these key developmental stages, especially early in life. So whenever you're assessing for or working with a client, understanding at what developmental level, which age is important, but age doesn't always tell you where somebody is developmentally. So that piece is going to be important too. When kind of unpacking, how that person was able to address their trauma or what they need to in whatever clinical setting you're in. Also, traumatic experiences can be a single incident or chronic incidents. One of the major criticisms of the original Adverse Childhood Experiences study is that it doesn't address these key pieces right here. It also, as I said, doesn't address poverty or assess for poverty. But you can have somebody who experiences physical abuse, let's say a severe incident, single incident of physical abuse at age 7, or you could have somebody who experienced extreme physical abuse between the ages of 5 and 12, and both of those circumstances are only going to be counted as one adverse experience on that particular questionnaire. And so this issue of intensity and duration of the adverse experiences is not in any way, shape, or form addressed in that study, which also to some degree makes the findings even that more powerful. But that is one of the criticisms. Some symptoms of traumatic effects. Again, this list is by no means exhaustive, but these are some of the ones that we might see. Sometimes symptoms or effects may have gender differences. Boys especially tend to externalize their symptoms, whereas girls tend to internalize their symptoms. So you may see things like being aggressive, kind of getting in fights, quick to anger, that kind of physicality, an expression of their, angst in a physical way. Those are kind of those more externalizing symptoms. You're going to see boys do that a lot more. That's also why we have a higher rate of boys in the juvenile justice system, is because those are the people who wind up having interactions with law enforcement in the system, as opposed to girls who may tend to do more of the cutting or dissociation. They're just going to fly under the radar, so they may not be. That doesn't mean that girls won't have externalizing symptoms and boys won't have internalizing symptoms, but just on the whole, we do tend to see that more. Hyperarousal, that's that really elevated baseline, always scanning, always checking to see, and assessing for threats, which our brain does all the time anyway. But this is a really it's a really ratcheted up level of that. And things like misinterpretation of cues and overreaction, these things can get more complicated and complex as people age. An overreaction of a 4-year-old is, maybe not as severe as an overreaction of a 15 or 16-year-old. And same with misinterpretation of cues. When we get into the adolescent unit, We'll have a discussion about how adolescents just on the whole, whether they, regardless of trauma history, are not that great at at interpreting facial expressions and facial cues. They pretty much only get happy or angry. And so they don't really pick up all of those things like frustrated or confused. They don't really pick up some of those more nuanced facial expressions. So if you think about cues and nonverbal communication, how much that really is involved in how we process trauma, a lot of this can wind up getting even more complicated when you talk about a trauma response in an adolescent. So things can get compounded over time. So most people can get through adverse experiences without developing trauma symptoms. And one of the key things to assess for is the presence or lack of presence of or absence of resilience and protective factors, because these protective factors have a huge impact in how a person is able to recover and grow and continue to develop in a healthy way over time. Recovery is very definitely possible. If you do have some of those long-lasting traumatic effects, that's what many of you all may be interested in working on, or what drew you to this field in the first place. You certainly wouldn't have a role as a therapist if recovery was not possible. So engendering hope and being those agents of hope for our clients is really important. So this is an example right here, just a case study of just kind of what can we're going to walk through a little bit of how these trauma responses can vary depending on the response of the people around the person who experienced the trauma. And so in this particular example, I have 3 6-year-old female victims of sexual assault by a neighbor. So in one example, the child tells their caregiver, they get support and nurturing, and the neighbor is prosecuted. In the second example, the child does not tell anyone at all, so there's not really any response whatsoever. And in the last example, the child tells their mother and gets scolded, saying, what the heck were you doing there? What did you do? How could you let this happen? Et cetera, et cetera. So lots of, victim blaming going on. So 3 very different and very possible and somewhat typical responses in these cases. So jumping into when a trauma can be unresolved. So in this particular example, actually keep jumping around. We'll go back here. So this is a great example of the first example of the 6-year-old girl experienced the assault. Without a doubt, her, HPA, freeze, fight or flight, response system is going to become fully online. Those non-essential systems like learning and memory and cell repair and digestive systems and immune systems, all of those things are going to be shut down during that event. Dr. Jim Hopper is an expert in the field of around the biology of sexual assault. And I did include a number of his resources on the Canvas site. So if you're particularly interested in that field and working with that population, I highly encourage you to read some of his information that I've included. He has a website with a lot of information, and he really talks about how people in this circumstance really, for the most part, they always freeze. And actually, it's not even just sexual assault. It's really just that kind of massive traumatic response in general. We always say fight or flight because that's what the researchers first coined. And so it just, we hear it. So that's what is just kind of most prevalent. But in reality, we typically freeze in a split second in order to figure out whether we want to fight or flee. So there is that kind of moment where, we're first freezing, and sometimes that gets overlooked. And again, there's some articles that I've included in the supplementary reading that really kind of articulate that further. So what we have here is you have the traumatic event, your HPA response system, which is a, in many ways, an uncontrollable, at least in the moment, physiological response to this trauma. It's not cognitive. It's not our prefrontal cortex. We are not sitting there and, with our arms crossed saying, Mr. Lion, I think that we should not, I think you should not eat me today. You're just not doing that. Your body, it's instinctual. It's a very elegant system that goes on, again, that Dr. Combs-Orm explained. So when that system is activated, our physiological system gets overwhelmed. Our psychological system can get overwhelmed, and you're kind of in the height of that acute traumatic response. Can look a number of different ways depending on the individual. But if you have an appropriate intervention, if you have a nurturing caregiver, if you're in a safe and stable environment, if you get whatever the help is that's needed based on your developmental level. In the first example, we saw that the neighbor who had done the assault was prosecuted, so there was a justice aspect to that. People who do bad things get punished. So there's lots of things that can contribute to this resolution, and because of that, there may be no lasting negative effects. It's like if you break your arm or you break your leg, and it gets set correctly and healed, you may walk just fine and run and not have any long-term physical effects, but you will always know that when you were 12 that you broke your leg. And so that's a comparable example of kind of a physical trauma that you might go through. And psychological and, those other life-threatening examples of trauma can have the same thing, and there's so many individual differences in how somebody responds to trauma. And it absolutely can get resolved in kind of a normal and healthy way. But oftentimes, those traumas go unresolved. And so you wind up in a cycle unless you get, help and healing, which many of your clients will be actively pursuing with you. You get in this cycle and basically this kind of coping and trigger cycle. So you experience the event. It does not go resolved. Maybe you're in examples 2 or 3 and you didn't tell anybody. So you are just, walking around feeling very unsafe, feeling like you did something wrong, knowing that nobody is there to support you. And you go into this, this coping piece. And can anybody tell me what some typical coping behaviors that you may see in the field or have known or witnessed people who have experienced trauma that they engage in?
A lot of my clients like to close off to cope with things. They just stop talking to people and just kind of keep to themselves.
So I like social isolation.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. That's a great one. What else?
Substance abuse.
Sorry?
Substance abuse.
Oh, classic, right? Why do we drink and use substances? Why do we do that?
Because we need something else to take our minds off of what's going on.
Yeah.
Kind of self-medicate.
Yeah, to self-medicate. We want to feel good or feel better, right? So that cigarette or that drink or that drug is going to take us out of that situation. It's going to take our head, put our attention somewhere else. Let's do one more.
Well, a lot of people self-medicate also in like an unconscious attempt to regulate their nervous system. So if they're feeling like hyper aroused, then they want to drink to calm themselves down, or if they're feeling really lethargic, they might use stimulants to try to find a balance on their own.
Right. So, and that's a key point about your, when you're in this whole HPA, response, like it, especially over a long period of time, it doesn't feel good. And when you have, you may be, again, individual differences, but you may be chronically anxious, or you may be completely lethargic, like Jamie said. You may experience depression, social isolation, basically all of those addictive behaviors. So it could be alcohol, substances, food, sex, gambling, shopping, all of those behaviors that can be really extreme. It's an attempt to get yourself out of a situation. You're coping, you want to feel better or feel differently.
Or like Charity said, self-harm.
Say that again?
A Charity put on the chat, self-harm, that's another.
Yeah, like cutting, like one of those, the self-injurious behaviors may even get to the extreme to, a suicide attempt. You just kind of can't take it anymore. And so when you get in this cycle, you cope because you are oftentimes faced with a trigger. And the trigger can be as varied as the individual traumatic event combined with the individual who experienced that event. So there's no one trigger out there that is automatic. I mean, there's kind of classic ones that we think about with PTSD, with post-traumatic stress disorder, with veterans, when, there's a lot of blogs and articles that come out around 4th of July talking about being respectful of veterans with all of the fireworks that are out there, because fireworks sound a lot like guns and bombs and, explosions and things like that. And so it can be very, very traumatic for somebody who's been at war and has, been in kind of chronic life-threatening situations like that. So that is something that we could kind of say, yes. And not every veteran is going to have that issue, but many do. But people who experience other traumatic events, people who've been in car accidents often don't want to get behind the wheel again, or they just feel very unsafe in the car when maybe they didn't before. So it really, really depends. But because you're out in the world and you're experiencing life, you may come into contact with these triggers. You may start to become aware, and a lot of healing can happen that way by, just understanding what your triggers are. And, either how to avoid them or how to cope with them in a healthy way as opposed to an unhealthy way. But essentially this pattern is that you get triggered by something. Let's say, you have to walk past a place where your, best friend was shot on the way to school every single day. You might be at risk of, walking past that place might be a trigger for you. And so as soon as you see it, or it's coming, and you experience the anxiety of, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to walk past there because there's no other place, there's no other way for me to get to school except to walk past that place, that playground or that basketball court or whatever it was. And so, whatever that trigger is, it's the experience of that trigger that is going to shock your system into this fight, flight, or freeze HPA response, which again, it's not conscious. It's not something that your prefrontal cortex is dealing with and is processing. It is a physiological, limbic brain response to a stimulus. And that stimulus for other people may be completely neutral, but for you, it may be an issue and may be tied and kind of irrevocably linked to this traumatic event. And so when that trigger hits, you go into this APA response, your systems become overwhelmed, and you go right back into the coping behaviors. And so people can spend their entire lives in this cycle, their entire lives. And without resolution, if you do not, stop to attend to it and to work through these issues and not, put Band-Aids, because essentially all those coping behaviors are, like someone said, it's you're self-medicating. You're trying to get better. But unfortunately, a lot of these classic coping behaviors and coping mechanisms are unhealthy, which really brings me to the last, slide that I want to cover. And again, please make sure you're reviewing all of these slides, but I wanted to talk about this one. This slide is not in the PowerPoint, I don't think that's posted online. It's the only one that I didn't include in there, but it's in your very first unit lecture. This slide is in there. I'm sure that many of you all have seen this slide. It is one of the most important things to come out of the original Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And we talk about it here because it's exactly what it says. This pyramid is a way for us to understand how adverse childhood experiences influence health and well-being throughout and across the lifespan, and how a lot of those experiences can then be transmitted intergenerationally, onto the next generation, and we wind up seeing a lot of cycles of abuse, cycles of trauma. Sorry, my mouse is very sensitive. And so I wanted to take a moment to walk you through this. But before I do, has anybody on the call seen this, or on the lecture seen this pyramid before? Are you familiar with this?
Yes, I've seen it in intro classes in my undergrad.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. It looked familiar, but the colors are just a little different.
Yeah. Does anybody who's seen it before, do you want to explain? You want to share your understanding of it with the class? I hate to do all the talking.
I don't know if I can do it very eloquently, but I can try.
Yeah, no, let's just try. We're
my fear. I was like, I don't know how to word it.
No, let's try.
Okay, so basically my understanding is that, the ACEs that we've been talking about, the adverse childhood experiences of the trauma, or, even it could even just be a divorce, make it to where your everyday living is disrupted. And then it makes just your development when the age that you are disrupted, and makes it harder for you to develop, which then impairs you and makes you try to find ways to hide that impairment depending on what it is. And then that could lead to any of the coping mechanisms we were talking about, unhealthy ones. And then that, plus the stress of the experience and the stress of trying to hide the disrupted neurodevelopment that it talks about, leads to all of the disease, disability, and social problems, which leads to you passing away early.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's this kind of A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, and it's one of the reasons why when we talk about, from a policy standpoint, return on investment in early intervention and early learning and anything early childhood in the first 3 years, in the first 5 years, in the first 8 years, if you can prevent these early adverse experiences. And again, the original ACE study, it's under age 18, so that's not necessarily early. It is kind of comprises childhood, but when we're really talking about, especially with disrupted neurodevelopment, we really are looking at some of those, the impacts in those very, very early years. And you're exactly right. When you have these experiences, it can lead to disrupted neurodevelopment. Bruce Perry, Bessel van der Kolk, people who have been researching trauma for a long time, do fabulous jobs of articulating what trauma does to our brain. The Romanian orphanage studies show us what neglect does to our brain. And we know that when you have heightened stress responses, even in the womb, and we'll talk more about that next week, even when you're in the womb, you, through fetal programming, and epigenetic transfers, you can learn that the world is a stressful place, and it can impact the way that your brain develops, so that when you experience stress postnatally after you were born, you may respond to it a different way than somebody who didn't experience stress in the womb. So there are a number of ways that ACEs can lead to disrupted neurodevelopment, and that disrupted neurodevelopment can then lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairments. And this is a lot of what we will see with school age children. And remember this as we move through the lifespan units, things like learning disabilities. If you are chronically stressed, what's one of the main parts of the brain that gets shut down? Who can tell me?
The hippocampus?
Absolutely. The hippocampus, which is responsible for learning and memory. And if all your non-essential systems are chronically shut down, you're not on point for learning. You are not at your best place. And oftentimes school itself, the act of going to school, being around teachers, being around authority figures, being around people who may be bullying you, can even further disrupt it, and create other difficulties. Somebody mentioned social isolation before. There's just a number of ways that that these different impairments may show up based on some of that disrupted neurodevelopment. And then in turn, those impairments can lead to the adoption of health risk behaviors. If you're not fitting in, if you are chronically stressed or anxious, or experiencing all those triggers like we talked about, you're going to adopt some of those coping mechanisms. The ACEs study shows things like the higher the ACE score, the higher number of, oftentimes the higher number, or the risk, again, this is all about risk, the higher number of sexual partners, which can lead to STDs. Then you get into also the risk for things like heart disease. And so all of those different coping mechanisms, in order to deal with the trauma and the stress that you've been experiencing the vast majority of your life, you're going to adopt these, if it's unresolved, these unhealthy coping behaviors. Over time, you may drink in college or something, or you may drink in high school. It may not necessarily lead to a full-blown alcoholism where you're drinking all the time or using substances all the time. But over time, if you are adopting these, poor eating habits, sedentary lifestyle, high stress. Remember the macaque monkeys from the documentary? The one researcher in Winston-Salem said, this is what stress looks like. Look at this picture of this plaque inside this artery wall. Atherosclerosis, it's a very visible sign of chronic stress. Same with the fat around the belly, where it sits on your body is a story of stress. So those health risk behaviors that are adopted over time can then lead to the disease, the disability, the social problems, any number of issues. And then it's that over time that leads to the early death. And what the study really shows, this is a public health perspective on a social problem. So if adverse childhood experiences is the social problem, this is a perspective of understanding the larger risks. So I encourage you all to look at the Tennessee ACEs report if you have not, even just skim it, even if you don't live in Tennessee. But, one of the big things that report highlights is that ACEs are fact, not fate. So this is a discussion of risk. So when we talk about risk factors and protective factors, having a high number of adverse childhood experiences, that correlates to a high number of, it's a high risk factor. So you are at risk of all of these other things. It does not mean by any stretch that you are going to develop these things. I'm sure many of you know people who have high ACE scores. Maybe you have a high ACE score yourself. The survey or the questionnaire is available to you. If you don't know your score, you can take that questionnaire and find out. But it is just it's a fact. But when we look at this research in the aggregate, we can see that it does have this massive impact on, throughout the lifespan. And the early death piece showed that people who had a ACE score of 6 or higher were at risk of early death by as much as 20 years. And that is not insignificant. I'm sure you all can understand. So that's one of the reasons I love this graphic, is because it tells a whole story in one picture, and really does help us understand this very intense problem. This pyramid, we call this the ACEs pyramid. It is evolving. You know, it's been about 20 years since the original ACE study was published. So be on the lookout for future iterations of this. I've seen some that actually integrate things like historical trauma, racism, oppression, actually underneath these adverse childhood experiences. And like I said, the original ACE study did not address things like did not address things like poverty. So I'll be very interested, and I hope you are too, into how this continues to evolve over time. So I'm going to stop there so that we can jump into our group presentation. But before I do, are there any questions? There were a number of slides in this lecture and all the lectures that, you know, help to kind of summarize a number of the readings and things like that and add to them. So I'll just check in to see if there's any questions before we switch gears with the group presentation. No questions? All right. Well, we are going to turn it over to Kimberly and Patricia and Hillary. Correct. And I will quit sharing if I can figure out how to do that. I don't know why. Oh, here we go. Okay. All right. The floor is yours.
Is Kim on here?
I am. I'm here.
Oh, yes.
Okay. So, let me get this up.
Just let me know when y'all are ready to start.
I think she's just trying to get the screen sharing.
Okay.
Here we go. Okay. Is it up?
Is it up? You see it? Can everybody see that? Okay.
Yes, they can see it.
So before I begin, was everybody able to open their handout?
Yes, I've got one pulled up.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for sending those.
You're welcome.
Okay, so our critical thinking presentation is on unit 4, the stress, trauma, and hormones. So I'm Patricia Laura Gary Bay.
I'm Hillary.
I'm Kimberly Johnston.
And this is our presentation. Okay. It has been over a decade since Hurricane Katrina. Even though many New Orleans residents still have not returned to the city, some believe that we can see the effects of the trauma of the hurricane and the crime rates there, as well as in other some large cities with many Katrina refugees, such as Houston. More important, many worry about the babies and children who have experienced not only the hurricane, but also their families' confusion, dislocation, and chaos since the hurricane. So how might social workers think about the effects of the hurricane on individuals who have suffered Katrina?
The physiological process of stress is meant to benefit human existence by way of promoting survival through what are sometimes perilous conditions. Chronic exposure to stress or trauma, such as the circumstances faced by survivors of Hurricane Katrina, leads to dysregulation within the HPA axis. This disruption to the body's typical stress response creates an urgent need to restore homeostasis. If this need is not met, the result is a high allostatic load, which leaves the body susceptible to an increased risk of deleterious health outcomes. Chronicity of stress, compounded by a combination of genetic and environmental factors, can eventually lead to significant changes in phenotype, such as the adverse health and behavioral outcomes exhibited by Hurricane Katrina survivors.
Next slide. Can you hit the next slide?
I'm trying to push the button. Oh, there we go.
Okay, there it is.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. Not all stress is bad stress. In fact, some stress is beneficial. There are 3 types of stress: positive stress, which are instances of low-level stress that are normal and healthy; tolerable stress, which are negative in value, unavoidable but tolerable if supportive relationships are in place; toxic stress is stress that an individual experiences when there is lack of supportive relationships to serve as a buffer between the stressor and one's ability to cope with it. The absence of supportive environment during periods of stress can be toxic to the developing brain and have long-term negative impacts on health and wellness. MEES, or mundane extreme environmental stress, is a type of stress that is often related to race and socioeconomic status. Types of MEES can include housing discrimination, educational disadvantages, and racial discrimination. Persistent exposure to mundane environmental stress, such as these, can greatly affect your health. Evidence indicates that kindling or repeated exposure to smaller stresses, such as racial discrimination and living in a race-conscious society, has a greater negative impact on health deterioration among African Americans as compared to whites than does exposure to a single traumatic event. This finding is especially pronounced among African American women, who are found to have aged quicker than both African American men and white women. Next. It's yours. The other paragraph just repeated itself.
Oh, okay. The risk for post-traumatic stress disorder and depression has been correlated with those who have experienced high-level exposure to hurricanes, in combination with socioeconomic indicators such as low levels of social support, and presenting with specific single nucleotide polymorphisms. Hurricane-related home damage and traumatic events have been associated with post-traumatic stress symptoms and psychological distress in low-income mothers who survived Hurricane Katrina. PTSS symptoms in this group still remained high 43 to 54 months post-hurricane exposure. Depression rates for African Americans were 86% higher than Caucasian participants who were surveyed 2 to 5 months post-hurricane. However, when controlled for socio-demographic characteristics, pre-existing vulnerabilities, social support, and trauma-specific factors, there was no longer a significant correlation.
Sorry, it's freezing up on me. There we go.
Of course.
Yeah.
Get into the stress. The HPA axis is named after 3 parts of the body known as the stress response system: the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary gland, and the adrenal cortex. The hypothalamus is known as the master regulator of the body and brain, and when triggered by a threat, it releases corticotropin-releasing factor to the brain to activate the pituitary gland. The adrenal gland then releases adrenocorticotropic hormone into the bloodstream to trigger the adrenal to trigger the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland releases cortisol, commonly referred to as the stress hormone, and is responsible for returning your body back to its normal state of regularity and balance, known as homeostasis. This is achieved through allostasis, typically in the form of regulatory body functions such as sweating or shivering. The release of these hormones aids your body in quick response to stress and provides you with energy to help you resolve stressful situations. Once the body returns to homeostasis, the parasympathetic nervous system takes control over bodily functions by relaxing the body and returning it to a rest and digest state.
Yay.
Oh. Trauma and stress can also have a detrimental impact on the health of children. Neurological and cognitive impairment, inclusive of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, sleep disorders, depression, anxiety, and drug abuse have been linked to unborn children whose mothers experience stress and depression during pregnancy. Through epigenetic inheritance, these traumatic experiences can influence gene expression when elevated stress hormones from the mother are transferred through the placenta to the unborn child. In regard to children who are directly exposed to Katrina and displaced from their homes, an increase in mental health services was associated with those who had faced separation from their parents or caregivers, lived in a shelter, or lived in government-provided temporary housing instead of their own homes. Younger children were found to demonstrate more mental health symptoms than adolescents.
Stress hormones divert all attention away from other systems within the body to focus exclusively on the threat at hand. This includes diverting energy away from the learning centers of our brain. Potential outcomes for blocking of new information can be seen in the form of behaviors and/or learning deficits, which can lead to labeling for both children and adults. This can affect an individual's ability to find or maintain employment, affect academic performance, or contribute to poor parental care. Research indicates that if social contacts are hostile or unsupportive, then psychological and biological stress responses are heightened. If social contacts are supportive and comforting, stress responses decline. Excuse me. The implications for social workers dealing with families or individuals experiencing stress or trauma-related adversity can be found in the need for social workers to relay or develop community resources such as therapies, rehabilitative facilities, employment services, educational enrichment programs, or parenting classes to help remediate and minimize the effects felt by populations experiencing disparate rates of access and to promote positive engagement between families and their communities. Stress is a physiological process for coping with a challenge and is not a feeling. Because it is a physiological process, stress often causes wear and tear on the body's systems and brain. Toxic stress disrupts the architecture of the brain and can undermine cognitive functioning. Individuals facing chronic stress, such as displacement from Hurricane Katrina, may encounter difficulties finding or maintaining employment. Child victims of Hurricane Katrina may experience exposure to chronic stress within their families and as a result may perform poorly academically. Considerations for child victims of Hurricane Katrina could be found in the use of accommodative curriculum, supplemental learning resources, and adaptive learning environments to cater to their needs. Toxic stress can affect behavior, changing the body's natural alarm system in ways that it responds to events that might not be stressful to others. As a result of toxic stress experience when trying to cope with a natural disaster, such as the case with victims of Hurricane Katrina, many individuals responded to mundane stresses through extreme behavioral changes, often engaging in looting and other criminal activity in order to gain access to necessities. Toxic stress can explain how adversity and inequity gets under the skin and built into the body. Children exposed to chronically stressful conditions have an increased risk of experiencing toxic stress themselves. As an effect of toxic stress exposure, children may exhibit poor academic performance, engage in maladaptive behaviors or delinquency, which could contribute to an already existing disparate rates of incarcerations among minority populations.
Okay, so following a disaster, victims and their families may display severe grief, shock, disorganization, denial, depression, guilt, anxiety, and aggression. As members of the community, SSD staff may share similar reactions. However, if trained and supervised professional social work staff should be aware of such emotions and channel them into action. In the past month, there has been natural disasters in many countries around the world, from hurricanes, earthquakes, and fires. Families have lost, families have lost their homes, families, friends, and pets. These disasters do not just affect the area of where it occurred, but neighboring cities, states, and countries. During these disasters, first responders go in to help those who survived. What would be the first steps of action for a social worker to help with after a natural disaster, as in Hurricane Katrina, Harvey, or Irma, the forest fires of California, and the earthquakes of Mexico? So the question is, what would be, as social workers, what would be our first steps to help you?
I would start with assessing for needs, like see what they actually need before I start doing much of anything else.
Mm-hmm. And at that time, you would have the resources, right, to be able to lead them to whatever the needs that they do have. Mm-hmm.
I would hope so, but I mean, I guess it would depend on where I was at during all of this. But yeah, I would try to at least show them where the resources were if I didn't, have them myself.
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up. Oftentimes, especially with natural disasters like hurricane, there is some kind of preparatory action plan in place. So making sure that, especially families who may not have access to immediate transportation, making sure that they're aware of bus routes or other ways to get to shelters set up in place within the community is important for them to know as well. And that's something as social workers we can provide to our communities that we're servicing.
I think one of the biggest things with Katrina was not expected to hit New Orleans like it was. So I don't know if they were in a state of emergency because it was supposed to hit Florida, but it went back out in the Gulf, and then it came back in at 175-mile-per-hour winds. So there was no evacuation order given. So the state felt the government was at fault, and they had a lot of they just felt like they were abandoned by the government, which is why there were so many lives lost. So a lot of people in Louisiana now are really, really scared of hurricanes because they're afraid that the government will misread a hurricane and it'll go back into the Gulf and come back in, and which is why Harvey and Irma were really scary hurricanes for the state of Louisiana. So for that particular hurricane, I think that just trying to help people with their frustrations against the government and feeling how the government let them down. That was like one of the biggest differences with Katrina.
Yeah. Also with Katrina, I believe some, if not a majority of places within New Orleans are at or below sea level. So anytime you're dealing with the potential for a natural disaster to come into a city that's that close to sea level, there should be evacuation plans in place for everyone. And that we're also kind of seeing the ramifications of how infrastructure can affect, especially those who are living in poverty or near poverty, because we're seeing the same thing in Houston. The way that the city was designed, it essentially floods. And there was no evacuation order issued for that either, knowing that they were actually in the path of the hurricane as well. So a lot of this is unavoidable trauma that citizens are experiencing that often leaves them feeling victimized by the people who were supposed to be there to protect them. So yeah, I think building a rapport among the community and letting them know that, you know, there are resources available to them and that they can rely on civil servants to help them is equally vital.
Well, there's also just letting them tell you what happened and get off their, you know, express the horrible experience they went through and listening to them so that they can have someone to listen to and get it off their chest and be supported. And
yes, social supports make a tremendous amount of impact for these populations that have been traumatized in this way.
I would say that as a social worker, the first steps I would do is, if I'm working at an agency, try to see what the relationship is between my agency and like the Red Cross or FEMA, to Courtney's point. And because I feel like there's so much chaos after one of these things, that just kind of going in blindly and not knowing where people are can make it more chaotic. So I think maybe I would look at more from like existing relationships, finding out where people are, where social workers are needed. That's probably, if there's a first step, that would be my first step.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so to prepare, social workers interact and work within various kinds of environments and communities. In the case of victims affected by Hurricane Katrina, social workers enter an environment full of devastation where entire families have been displaced and some lives end in death. Although social workers are professionals, they are not immune from having feelings. Let's face it, this career path is not chosen for financial reasons, but because a social worker has a heart for a call to service, such as helping clients achieve a life of good health, good financial stability, education, justice, and the list goes on. Social workers in particular are professionals who are often trained to focus on the needs of others, but often neglect their own being. So how would you, as a social worker, what can you do to personally prepare to go into these extreme environments and perform professionally to take care of yourself?
Are we talking about like when you go to a shelter and you start helping people, or later on?
Like as a social worker, how would you prepare like for personally, you know, emotionally,
self-care,
psychologically prepare?
Yeah.
You know,
I don't necessarily know if there's a way to completely prepare for some of the things that we're going to see in the field. However, I believe that self-care is very important for me. I love poetry. I love to read. I love jazz music. So I just identify those things that bring me to a calm place and allow me to, you know, remain focused and motivated in what I'm trying to do, which is change the lives of other people. So just self-care and just really knowing what works for me.
Mm-hmm.
I think also just knowing where you're going to stay. So like a lot of the National Guard for Houston, they were staying in the hallways of high schools that opened it up to them. So if you know you're going to be staying in an area like that, maybe bringing something to help you be more comfortable so you can sleep at night. You know, non-perishable food items, if you have room, if you can pack some of those, just things like if you're going to be out in the field like that, as opposed to being in an office setting.
True. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I also think being realistic about the fact that you can't help it. I mean, I think we all realize this, that we want to help everyone, but we can't necessarily do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, you know, someone mentioned before, just being able to listen to people's stories sometimes. I mean, if you know the resources that are available, You know, there may not be many, but sometimes maybe all you can do is give a listening ear. I think that may also be helpful as well. But just being realistic about the fact that, you know, you are armed with what you have, you know, the knowledge you have and the way you can connect people the best you can. And you'll listen to people, but you're not necessarily a savior. You can't really fix everything. I think everyone, you know, in a situation with a disaster, people are scrambling. So if there's probably a calm person in the bunch who understands their, you know, I guess their limits and what they can give and is willing to do that, I think that's, you know, a relief as well to most people who are very frantic and, you know, are living kind of in chaos.
I agree.
Absolutely, I agree. Great point.
Realistic expectations, that's the key to holding your own stressful environment intact. You know, you can't get too disappointed about what's going on because, you know, like you said, you can't help everybody, but you have to do the best you can. So yeah, that's perfect. Realistic expectations.
Yeah, and this all kind of ties into what we were discussing earlier about developing appropriate coping skills, especially when we are immersed in a traumatic environment. Because, I mean, seeing people in distress is distressing itself. And if we aren't able to cope effectively, we aren't able to help effectively. So I think that it's you know, it's two-pronged. You know, if we want to be as effective as we possibly can, we also have to be in the most effective mental state. And that includes limiting our stress response and making sure that, you know, we do have that mind frame where, like, we know that we can't help everybody, but we're going to do what we can to help a few.
Also, I think another good first step would be, like, if you're living in a different state or a different community, to start advocating in your community for people who have been displaced from their home, to find places to stay and stay in contact with FEMA and all those other agencies to let them know you have available places for people to come if they don't have a home anymore. That would be a good first step.
Mm-hmm. Any other suggestions?
Okay. Thank you.
So that concludes our presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for posting it on the discussion board. If you can go ahead and stop sharing, that would be great.
Okay, now I need to figure out how to stop.
I know. Go up to options, I think. Yeah. The little carrot right next to the green. Right here. Oh wait, that's not it.
Right, how did I do it? Let's do that.
Ah, perfect. Well, fantastic. Well, that was great. It showed us how there's a lot of information in there, and really appreciated the discussion questions. One of the things that I was thinking about is having a lot of compassion for all the people who are in Puerto Rico right now, 3.5 million people without power and about to be without water and diesel and lack of generators and really
no help.
Yeah, very, 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 very little help. And same with the U.S. Virgin Islands and a lot of the other islands down there. It's been a heck of a season. Grateful to be dry. And I had minimal issues when Harvey came through Nashville too. Okay, I feel like there was one other point. Oh, one thing, I appreciated the discussion around self-care, because we can't really talk about self-care enough. It's really more important that we're actually doing self-care. So yes, we want to talk about it, but we actually want to be doing it. And I really appreciated, I forget who said it, but the person who said, being really intentional and knowing what works for you. That's really one of the major pieces about self-care, as I'm sure you all know at this point. So knowing what works, knowing how to anticipate the additional stress you might experience in that kind of a disaster situation, a crisis situation. And also, it really ties very well into the whole discussion for this unit around the stress response and the HPA axis. As social workers, you're humans too. You are not immune from that stress. And so sometimes the self-care is learning how to manage your own stress response system, because you're not doing anybody any good if you are under chronic stress. And a lot of the positions that you all will be in are going to be extremely stressful positions. And sometimes you may love the work, but it's the agency or the culture of the environment that is extremely stressful. I know a lot of people who have worked in child welfare, and they all pretty much say the same thing. It's not the work with the families that's hard. It's working within that such a institution and that system and all the bureaucracy and it just can be overwhelming, and feeling like their hands are tied, that they can't actually get the families the services that they need. And so it winds up, where you're in a position where you can work with people who are traumatized, and then work within an agency or an institution that then further traumatizes the people that you're working with and yourself. And so understanding that self-care has to address those larger pieces. And when you're out there interviewing with potential placements, asking those questions around, what is your culture of wellness? As a supervisor, as an agency, how do you make sure that your employees and your therapists are well taken care of and are supportive, and that you encourage, whatever those self-care, pieces are. I talked to a director of a program, very large program, mental health program one time, and I thought she had a great point about supervision. She said that a good supervisor knows when their clinicians or when their therapists are kind of heading towards burnout, even before the clinicians themselves. So when you're actually in that supervisory role, being able to understand, where your people are and how to support your people is a huge kind of piece of this work as well. And lastly, one more comment about why it's so important that you all understand the mechanics and all of the physiological pieces around the stress response system is that we are really at an exciting time in this particular field with where our evidence-based practices are heading. And many of those practices are evolving to either, integrate or be completely what we would consider a body, a bottom-up approach, a body-based modality. When you have experienced trauma or you are under chronic stress, knowing that the HPA system is it's right there in the forefront of the work that you need to do. You can't necessarily talk your way through those things. It's not like CBT is going to get you, it's like the be-all end-all of everything, or talk therapy is the be-all end-all of everything. You may need to integrate things like mindfulness-based stress reduction, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and revisualization. There's now trauma-sensitive yoga. Whatever those things are, understanding that sometimes you're going to need to have a top-down approach and be more cognitive and cerebral and talk through those things from a psychological standpoint. But you also need to process those traumas from a physiological standpoint. And if you're interested in learning more about this area, I highly recommend Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. He gives a fabulous, it's just a fantastic book, talks a lot about body-based modalities, talks about the history of PTSD, talks about how trauma affects the brain. It's a great book to have on your shelf to refer to later. So be on the lookout for those. Oh, that's awesome. I just saw your comment, Jamie. So highly encourage you all to check in with those things. Look at some of those supplementary materials if you're interested in learning more. So that is all I have for this evening. We've got about 15 minutes for office hours. Before I stop recording, are there any other questions? The name of the book, Kimberly, is The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And I quoted him. He's on the slide, so you can see how his name is spelled.
I know that this is also an effective approach when, at least we've kind of incorporated it when we work with our little guys who've experienced traumatic experiences or who have high stress levels in the home or stress responses, is really incorporating like body movement. And I mean, they're actually even incorporating it in school. I know we talked about school being the potential for having the potential to be a stressful environment for little guys. And I was looking at some of the curriculum for my son, and they've incorporated kind of like this, they have like a yoga time during the week, or, you know, like a free movement time. And then they use a lot of like drum therapy. So it's pretty neat to see that the change just within, you know, the 2 years that it's kind of started.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Yeah, a lot of schools around Nashville are integrating mindfulness and meditation into their classrooms. Even just like, I think they do, the University School of Nashville does a curriculum with their elementary school, and I think up to their middle school, where they do 5 minutes at the beginning of every single class, and they have seen their academic outcomes like shoot up.
Wow.
Yeah, so there's lots of neat stuff going on. Okay, great. Any last comments or questions before I stop recording? All right, well, I have enjoyed being with you this evening, and I look forward to seeing y'all in a couple weeks, and I'll post the Zoom link under that next unit, and feel free to email me in the meantime. Talk to you soon.